So I've reached a point after months of doing body work all through the summer, of wanting to do a video to show some of the pre-assembly work that I've done on the car, and then walk through the different areas of the car that I've paid attention to that you might want to look at prior to actually assembling the car. The book will tell you to get the body to 100% in terms of the body work, and blending all the bond lines, doing all this stuff, the roof scoop and the front of the car up there where the vents are, and getting all that stuff done, and then rounding the corners and the radiuses and all that, and then take the body to the paint shop. And what I've done is I've done a lot of the body work, and I've prepped the car and primed it with epoxy on the main areas, like the main body here, and have left some of it for some pre-work. I'll walk through that. But the main point is I've got epoxy primer on the car, and what I want to do is get the body to the point where I'm almost to the point of taking it to the paint shop. But I want to actually have the body on the car mounted and do the inner fender skirt work and some of the other stuff that I need to do, and actually paint this part of the body on the car. That'll lessen the amount of time that I'm working around in the shop and everything, and it'll lessen the chance that I actually scratch the car as I'm doing a lot of the stuff that I need to do for the final assembly. So I'll walk through some of that. I'll show you some of the stuff that I've been working on, show you some of the hard parts on the car. And the whole idea here is not to stop and do 150 different videos of everything. What I wanted to do is kind of capture the whole thing and just do kind of a methodical walkthrough of some of the things to look for before you make that decision to actually assemble the car. So I'm going to take the camera off and do a little walk around. So one of the challenges that I've had is there's a large amount of body work. The first thing that guys will see is when they start working the car, you have the bond lines that run along the top of the fenders, and then up along here, and then all the way this way, and then of course right down the center. You ask yourself, well, why do they do that? It's in the most visible area of the car, on the fenders and the top of the car. So it's a big challenge to get that stuff filled in correctly so that you don't have obvious areas that aren't blended in right and sanded right. So you'll see all those imperfections as you if you don't use the correct lighting and everything as you're sanding the car. So as you can see, I've got the vents in the hood. I've got the roof scoop on, and I've gone around and fixed all the imperfections on the body. I've got the doors fitted, and I check my gaps everywhere. And so this is the point that I've gotten the car, and it's real close to actually going to paint, but I still haven't done a lot of the work on the inner fenders in the interior. Again, some of the challenges are, the roof scoop. One of the big things here is you have a large flange along here that needs to be blended in so that it flows down into the skin, and then you have some tricky spots and radius and things like that that run through here. And for all this type of work, I did use a sanding block. I've got a little kit that has some rubber sanding blocks that I use. And the kit that I have is from a company called Durablock, or the kit's called Durablock. And you can kind of see a picture there of various types of sanding blocks. So there's some round ones and some square ones and some other ones that make it easy. I've also got various just about everything, files. These things work really good, by the way, for getting corners. I would highly recommend that you get these sanding pads. I've got them in 120, and then I've got some 220, and then some others that are 320. And what you'll find out is those things conform real nice to a lot of the radiuses. I don't know that I would have been able to do the work that I've done to the extent that I have without those particular sanding blocks. And then, you know, I've got a million different types of, you know, sandpaper of, you know, various. I've got my used sandpaper drawer. I've got, you know, some new sandpaper in here. And I've got, you know, all those other tools that I just showed you. So, you know, it's a mix and match. It's whatever you think works the best for getting into the corners. Anyway, so again, this is real challenging here. You have to basically grind that flange down. When you get this piece, you'll cut out, or you'll cut some off of the sides. It'll extend all the way out pretty far. And what you want to do is you want to cut that flange in on that whole scoop, and then sand down the edges of the that flange, so that you can get that thing as thin as possible as it begins to transition into the roof. And then what you do is you glass that in with matte mold glass, and you'll end up with imperfections, and then you'll come back and fill that in. What I used for that is the Evercoat or Everglass. It's a short strand filler, and that's a pink can. It's part number 10622. And then I'll be talking about this stuff, which is an Evercoat product. It's called Slick Sand. It's a high solid or a polyester primer surfacer, and it's got quite a bit of fill capability. I'd say that's about as thick as some of the gel coat. So for replacing all those areas on raw fiberglass that you've sanded down, if you use a coat of this and sand it down, then you end up with you know, a glass smooth surface. This is a door. This shows some of the slick sand on the door in the result. So you get a real nice surface that's one color to work with. And then you can come back after you know, so you do the rough body work first. You do all the hard stuff, the obvious stuff, and you'll have the red color of the car. Kind of like you start with this hatch here, and you can see there's a lot of imperfections along the radiuses and at various points. You know, through here it's real rough, and you know, other areas the radiuses aren't right, and so there's all kinds of little imperfections that you'll fill in and work with. And then once you get to that point, you know, you have different color fillers and everything all over the place, and it's kind of hard to really see the imperfections if you don't have a single color. So what I do is I go to the slick sand, and you know, I shoot that with I think it's like a 2.5 millimeter tip. It's a filler gun that I use with about 55 psi, and I shoot that just like paint. And once you shoot that on, it'll be a somewhat coarse surface at first, but after you sand that down, you'll have a gray, real nice smooth gray finish in this door. You can see the slick sand sanded down, and then as I transition right here, this is actually epoxy primer, and there's slick sand under it, and then this is slick sand. I haven't primed the doors yet because I'm doing the final fitting on the door. So anyway, you'll have all those different colors, and especially on the roof scoop, you'll get to that point. Those different colors will drive you crazy. So again, the slick sand helps to visualize the you know, where the imperfections are on your paint. You know, as you can see, the lights you know, shining in different areas. I use those lights, you know, different areas as I go along the car. You can see up on top of the fender over there, you know, where I'll walk along and I'll spot various imperfections, and then I'll work those, you know, until I don't see them anymore. A lot of times I'll spray the fender or whatever the piece is with water, and I'll be able to see the sheen from the water as I'm working those areas. So anyway, some of the things you want to look for, especially on the doors, since I'm standing here. Everybody knows the doors are a challenge, and so what I did is I went through all the headache of cutting the frames, making the door fit, trial fitting the glass, trial fitting the seals, making sure that I have the correct gaps in here where the seal goes. There's a gap right here that needs to remain clear. There's a gap along the window right here, so you want to have that window in place so that you have a nice smooth transition across the glass like that. And then at the same time you have the transitions and the lines that meet. You'll have areas where your seals go. Along here, these can be troublesome, so you want to make sure your seals all made up to where they need to be before you get to this stage. And you'll want to make sure that your glass comes up and rests against the seal that's going to be on this flange. Here I've added an aluminum piece and then I radiused that in. And what this does is it covers up the big gap that's up here. You'll see that when you do your trial fit. I talked a little bit about that in the last video. But anyway, this piece is there and radiused, and that keeps the wind and the rain from escaping around the front end of the window there. It's a real tight fit in terms of trying to make that work. It's just real close. You got to pay a lot of attention to where your window goes and whether or not this is clear once your windows is up, and really how your door closes. As the door closes, you could very easily interfere if this isn't cut back in this direction. If there's too much material here, your window will run into that. So as the door closes, you'll see the window engage that seal, and then it finally meets up here once the door's closed. So some of the another area that's challenging along the door and this area is these coves have to be reworked and sanded all the way down and through, and you'll have radiuses along here that also need to be reworked, and then of course up underneath there there's a big mismatch. So the bond line is actually down through here, and what you'll do is you'll end up having to rework and fill in right here where that radius is, so it's a real pain in the neck, and you have to wipe these radiuses out with the sandpaper as you're kind of going down along there with a sanding block, and then that comes all the way in. I'll show you on the other side, but it comes down to there, and then there's a transition to nothing as it flows down onto the door. There's an area here where you'll see where you can adjust before you do final assembly. You can adjust the position of the body before riveting it to the frame, and you just want to make sure that you have a nice smooth transition for your door all the way up. There's actually a twist in this door that's by adjusting the bolts on the frame and the stuff on the inside of the door, you can actually get this door to twist a little bit in or out, and at the top and the bottom, and you'll find out there's probably 10 different ways to get the 10 different adjustments in order to get this door to fit correctly. There's an in and out movement here. There's a this movement. There's a fore and aft movement, and then there's a height adjustment, and then of course all the other stuff that you have to do to get the window to roll up correctly. This is a critical area in here in terms of your paint. You want to make sure that when your door opens, you have clearance right in that gap there. As you can see, it gets real close. And you want to install that bumper on the inside. There's actually a bumper you'll see on your on the frame. It's the same part that the bushings are engaged in. That has a place where you can put a bumper, and that bumper contacts the frame on the inside once this door is open all the way up. So you want to make sure you put that in and then run this thing until it's open all the way, and that bumper's engaged. And that bumper's actually engaged right there, and you can still see the clearance. And then when you close it, you'll see the gap right there, and you want to have a reasonable gap. You don't want that wide open, so you got to trim
this area here back, a little bit, while you're watching this area here. You don't want to overdo it, so you got to balance it between the back and the front. And then the other thing I did, you'll see I have a little bit of adjustment still available on the body, but what I did, I'm going to set the camera down for just a second. And I just gave it a little tug, and I haven't tightened it down yet, but I wanted to show you where I reworked the corner here. So I closed this, so I added material. I was actually short about 1/2 inch, and this thing came all the way down to about here. And so I had to add this whole end onto this corner, and then I had to cap it off. I made a piece of metal that basically with a compound curve that formed into this shape here. And then I used that piece of metal for a mold, and I made the cap, and then I glassed that whole piece on, reinforced the backside, and I got that thing to conform so that when everything's closed, it looks clean and finished from all the different angles. And then, of course, I've got the point here. I've got to watch that, and then at the same time, I've got to watch that. Right now, it's not fit exactly. I'll show you the other side. Looks quite a bit better on the other side. I'll walk over there real quick and show you some of this stuff. So here you can see the transition of that same thing, and then if you look up there, you can see where it conforms, to the body, so that when that thing actually shuts, you have a nice conform. So what I'll do is I'll space that gap there almost similar to the doors, and then at the same time I'll have a gap in there so that this isn't chattering and riding on there. I'll probably add some chafe tape. I'll show you some areas you need to be careful of. And here you can see I've got areas where I've actually got one end of this thing rubbing slightly here, so I'll need to the problem is when you open this body or this front end, it shifts back and forth. So if you're leveraging from this side, then that side is moving around, and so it's moving around and banging on here. It's not all closing at the same time, so that's kind of a pain in the neck. There's no real good way to stabilize the whole front end as you're closing it. So when you grab here, that side's flopping around over there. So when you get close, what you want to do is you want to center your hand here, and then grab this at the same time and kind of, hold that whole thing to limit that from bouncing around once you come down to engage the latch over there. So got to be careful, you don't scratch your paint. I'm thinking about putting some 3M chafe tape here. I might put a little metal, formed metal cup to protect against the latch. And then, just a little tiny thing, maybe to rivet it in there, or maybe I'll just put 3M tape, I don't know yet. And then I've got a little bit of a chafing issue up here. I think it was caused actually from the inside edge right here for the same reason. When you're on that side, holding on to that side, then this side bounces around. And so you got to watch these areas, make sure that you protect them. Same thing along this edge if you close it off. That's that area that I closed off along there, and then it's all you can't really see it, but it's all reinforced behind the backside. I used a gator guard on the inside here. It's a two-part epoxy bed liner. It turned out okay. I'm not really too excited about it, but it's good enough for I mean, it looks nice. It's not a big deal, but if I had a choice, I wouldn't use the gator guard again because of the Kevlar. It's got a Kevlar, and it's super tough. I think I'd rather go with a more flat, bed liner, like a rubberized. So I went ahead and bought another kit. The gator guard's pretty expensive. It's I think it was about $65 for a quart, two-part, kit, and it's okay. It's there. It'll work, and a lot of this area up in the front is closed off anyway. The other thing I did is I shot this with a ceramic paint. It's a clear ceramic, so it's bulletproof paint. You can't touch this thing in terms of chemicals, and super hard, so it resists scratches. But man, it's a, you know, it was spitting out of the gun, and after a while I was like, well, you know, it's under the hood, not a big deal. I'd have preferred that this was a little bit smoother. But, you know what, it's okay. It's not a big deal. I may doctor that up at some time after the build. Anyway, so that's that. Here's these lines again. You know, some of the more important lines. This is the one that will be, you know, your door panel will align with this once your door is closed. And so the transition that I showed you down through here is real important, that you don't sand that out, you know, and make it disappear. So you really want to be gentle with the sanding block. So, you know, when you got a lot, you know, use a lower grit, and then, you know, as you get up into these areas, you may want to switch up to 220 or higher as you start, you know, blending down into the body. Again, you know, same thing here. You know, you got a transition here. You have the radiuses coming down through here and then into here, and then all this stuff all the way up around the you know, the back of the car, and then of course up and along here, and then again the same, you know, transitions down here. And all this is where you got to, you know, with that sanding block again, I'm using sanding blocks, and I'm also using the stiffness of the paper kind of rolled, and I'm working the paper so that I force the paper. I never go straight up and down. I move the paper this way and kind of around while I'm moving down, and then I come back in the opposite direction, and that gives me a nice crisscross. So I'm not digging gouges down deep with the sandpaper. Sometimes you'll see the sandpaper on the, or the grit in the sandpaper will follow the same groove, and you'll end up with double the depth of the scratch mark. So you want to crisscross that so you have an even amount of material being taken off. You don't have big scratch marks. And I'm talking like 180 grit when I first hit these after I fill them, and then you know, progressively less, and then ultimately with one of those 3M sanding blocks, and you could literally press that 3M sanding block right into that thing and just press it in there, and, you know, do that. You don't really need to worry about rolling it like you do the sandpaper. The sanding blocks conform to the radius, and, you know, all the way around it from start to finish, and it'll just sand that whole area down. You got to be a little bit careful with the sanding blocks, because if your sanding block is pressed against the radius and it's formed a little bit over you know, the top and a little bit on the other side, then as you go back and forth, what happens is you'll end up with a slightly low spot across that whole area. So you want to make sure and hit this area, hit this radius, then hit this area again. Make sure that this whole area is covered. A lot of times the sanding block will actually cover that whole area, but maybe not the area that's you know, on the other leg of what you're trying to sand. So if I was trying to sand this, for instance, I would have the sanding block against like that, going this way, but I wouldn't have the sand block sideways going that way, because then I would end up with a low spot here. Anyway, so in terms of the interior, you know, prior to paint, I've got to do the roll bars. I've got to coat those. I'm thinking about a coat them, I say that, but basically apply the fabric to the roll bars. And what I'm thinking about doing is maybe working in a overhead console. I've got a headliner. I've got an overhead console, and so the headliner on this I can split in half by having that overhead console. You can see the bolts up underneath there. So that overhead console will split it in half, and that'll allow me to actually fit you know, half in on each side, which will cut down on the hassle of trying to get a big giant headliner in there all at once. So I may work that a little bit. Here you can see the outflow of the vent. I've got a kind of an air-water separator that actually bolts up in place there, and it has an outlet on the left and the right of that vent. So it captures water and drains the water down to each side of the engine compartment, and you really can't see it. But and then there's a bunch of holes in that thing that take the air. The air is redirected away from the water inside the separator, and the air will flow into the engine compartment, and the water will flow out the sides of through the tubes. Anyway, so there's that. I've got my back end lined up. I might have shown you before that on, here you can see based on that back spacing I did on that calculator, I put together in Excel the back spacing on this is with no spacers at all. These are 350 or 305, I think, tires, and I'll make sure I'm telling you the right thing. So yeah, these are 30 ZR19 305, so 305 30 ZR19s, and the back spacing worked out real nice. They still look plenty wide in the back, and I don't need a monster tire. These tires look pretty monster on this car. This is a small car, so 305s are fine. You don't have to go much further than that, and worry too much about all the stuff you got to do to adapt. These are, again, no spacers. The information on the setback on the setback on these wheels is on my website. So it's right flush with the car sides, and then when I go to the other side, it should be the same. So it's pretty close to the same, and so you get a nice clean profile when you're looking at it from the front, where those tires are pretty much even with the sides of the car. Actually, the rear end's pushed over a little bit, slightly, but you can't tell. So you get a nice clean profile, which looks really good, for cars like this. One of the big things the manufacturers do is, they typically will be real careful about making sure that those wheels are right in line with the side of the car, and it just looks like they were made into one piece in terms of the body and the wheels and everything together. Here's some little markers I added, kind of cool. I think these are from